Good evening. My name is Matt Papich. I will be presenting on group behavior, conformity, and group processes today. I will discuss these topics in 5 segments. They are individual adaptation to group pressure, influences of individual adaptation, things that cause those adaptations, responding to the demands of others in the forms of compliance and obedience, and then groups, how they form, the definition, and what problems can arise within them and between groups. And also how these group issues can be solved. So we'll begin with conformity. Conformity is defined as the tendency to change our perceptions, opinions, or behavior in ways that are consistent with group norms. This is first illustrated by Muzafer Sharif's study, 1936, the autokinetic effect. He took participants into a dark room and shined a light on the wall. And this is an optical illusion. The light doesn't actually move, but it appears to move on the wall. So participants were asked, how far does the light move? And then they were asked to come into groups and discuss these things. And even though the light never actually moved, the groups came to a group decision on actually how many inches the light had moved across the wall. The second major study in conformity came from Solomon Asch in 1951. In his study, as pictured here, participants were shown a card that had 1 standard line and 3 example lines, and they were asked which line measures up most evenly to the standard line. Now, the participants were in a room with a group of Confederates. They did not know this, but the Confederates would answer first, and then the participant would be allowed to answer. However, some of the times the Confederates would answer incorrectly. It's a simple task, so the answer should be simple, and this was very confusing. But the participants often would agree with the groups of participants that disagreed, even though even afterwards they would say, I knew I was right, but I just agreed with the group. Thus, many studies on conformity began. So there are 2 types of influence that we're going to discuss related to conformity. They lead to conformity. They are informational influence. Means one believes that others are correct. That means they've established a strong argument. And this usually leads to private conformity, which means that somebody changes their own beliefs. They actually believe what somebody is trying to get them to believe. And then the other type is normative influence. And this means that they change their opinions because they fear retribution. They fear that they're going to become a social outcast, or they're going to be antagonized. And this usually leads to public conformity, in which somebody conforms around the public, around the people around them, but they don't necessarily change their personal beliefs. They keep a private, personal belief that's different from the social. Some other influences that lead towards conformity or group normatives are group size. So how many people are trying to convince you to believe a certain things or act a certain way can have an effect. However, this is related to the law of diminishing effects, which says the amount of people is only meaningful up into a certain number. After a certain number, it might not be as effective as it started. For example, compared to a light bulb in a dark room. I'm in a fairly dark room and I have 1 light bulb, and if I were to add another light bulb, it would be much lighter. It would be able to see me a lot better. However, if there were 100 lights in this room and I added 1 more light bulb, the effect would be meaningless, probably unnoticeable. The other type that might draw somebody towards conformity are norms. These are rules or expectations that present in certain group situations that people understand and follow, such as members of the same team might wear a uniform, or there's a dress code, certain things like that, which take effect amongst the group, and everybody kind of takes attachment to them. There are influences, however, that can pull people away from group majorities and group norms. One is called the allies technique. So for example, Reese and Wallace made a study about teens and their drinking habits. And if one teen was in a group of friends who all drank, they were more likely to pick up drinking habits. However, if the teen had 1 ally, that is 1 other person in the group who did not drink with them, even though they were outnumbered by the majority, that teen was less likely to drink. They felt that ally situation. And it only takes 1 person to have that effect. Another reason minority influence can have an effect, developed by Moscovici, says that 1 minority member of a group, if they hold a strong, calm, firm, and unyielding opinion, many people might be convinced by that opinion. And this is a person who is strong in their beliefs. They don't yield and go back and forth. So that can actually pull people from the majority into that minority. Another process called idiosyncrasy credits, developed by Hollander, said that a minority member can join a majority and accept their norms and their values, and then slowly peel away. And because they've already joined the group and they've been accepted and people have identified with them, as they pull away, they might pull people with them, which is the idiosyncrasy credits of minority influence. The next topic we'll talk about is obedience and compliance, two other ways people can be influenced by others. So we'll talk about the norm of reciprocity. This is when somebody does something you view as beneficial, you almost feel compelled or obligated to pay them back. So this is often used with salesmen and people who are trying to get you to partake in an investment. And they can do these in multiple ways. So one example is making a small request first, then get you to agree with that, and then move into a large request. So that small to large, an example, this is the foot in the door technique. Somebody may try to get you to agree to a small request, and once you do that, then they'll give you the real request. And since you've already been complying, you keep up that pattern and you continue to comply. Another example is this large to small method, in which you make a large, grand, even above natural request of something. Say, this is normally $100, but then you say, but for you, I'll bring it down to 75. This is called the that's not all technique, and you always see this with infomercials. You know, if you call now, you'll get more than if you call later, that type of thing. Obedience has taken a strong turn, and a lot of attention has been paid attention to it throughout history. Beginning, we talk about Nazism and the different terrible things that have happened throughout the world, the slaughter of millions of people. And a lot of the folks afterwards said, who committed the murders were saying they were just taking orders. This interested a lot of social psychologists. Stanley Milgram, 1963, he did a study where he brought participants in and he told them that another participant was to be shocked, given electric shocks every time they answered a question wrong. And the participants would have a lab director there telling them that they need to shock the participant. And they would continue to pull these switches and shock the participants, even though they would scream in pain and tell them to stop. Now, the other person was a confederate to study and wasn't actually being shocked. However, it's shocking, pun intended, how far people went in shocking the other participants and showing that belief that they need to follow those directions and follow the authorities' directions. So these kinds of things, these witnesses of moments in history and these studies show, it begs the question, is there an excuse for certain behaviors when somebody tells you to do something? And it's something to consider. The next topic we'll talk about are groups. Groups and how they are formed. The definition of a group is a set of individuals who interact over time and have a shared fate, goals, or identity. So groups take all manner of forms. They can be teams, they can be business members, they can be all types of things. But they're usually brought together through three ways. The first way is through roles, so people understand their roles, so in a hierarchy of businesses and things like that. And roles come in two versions. There's formal roles where you have a boss and a trainer and a director and an understudy, a teacher, a student. And then you have these labels they're associated with your role. And then there's also informal roles, such as a motivator or somebody who offers emotional encouragement or maybe even discipline at times. So these roles can often form these different identities within a group, and people can adopt them and become a group that way. There's also norms. So norms can push people into a group. We talked about earlier, norms are rules or expectations that people will follow. So when these rules and expectations are in place, people will feel this kind of group tendency, and they come together and they rely on this structure. And there's also group cohesiveness, and cohesiveness basically means how tight people are. I felt very, very tight with my college basketball team, and we did everything together, and we went everywhere together, and we were in the same classes, same parties, same social environments. Of course, spending 18 hours on a long bus ride together can do that. It brings that kind of camaraderie together. But these are how groups are formed, that time spent together and that tight-knitness that makes up a group, as well as our roles and as well as the norms within our group and how we were accepted amongst each other. So the next topic we'll talk about are group problems, things that can arise within the group. So groups within groups, members of one group can suffer from social loafing. That is, one member of the group feels they can do less because they are supported by the rest of the group. They can also suffer from de-individuation, which means one member joins the group, and because there's a group influence, they lose their self-identity. They feel that they don't have a dog in the fight individually, and they just join group consensus. There's also groupthink. And groupthink is where people get together and they focus more on agreeing with each other than being accurate and being productive. So they search for common ground when not necessarily that common ground and agreement can be very, very profitable or very successful, which we call an example of process loss, where the group fails to meet certain standards or be as accurate or proficient as they could be. These type of techniques can happen between groups as well, where one group might be combative towards another group or not get along with another group because they identify so strongly with their own group, so they'll have in-group and out-group biases. I identify strongly with my own in-group, therefore I don't like members of an outside group. This could lead to many struggles, and this is widely studied. An example of this, Hawley, Hosch, and Bovade said they showed college athletes that might be more tolerant of unhealthy behaviors by other college athletes than they would be of if a non-athlete had the same behaviors. So even though the same behavior took place, because they identified with that member of their same group, they actually had a higher or lower standard. This can lead to isolation and withdrawal from other groups and really lead to a narrow-minded worldview, which definitely can lead to group conflict, and we've seen it historically even wars. So what do you do with these group problems? Our final process here, our final solution we talk about is avoiding early agreement is a good example. So somebody can assign a group, and rather than meeting right away to discuss what one person thinks we should do, you divide up into small subgroups, and everybody comes up with their own solution, and you bring them to the table, and everybody discusses their solutions. You create systems and you encourage systems that promote criticism and dialogue, where people can compare and contrast ideas and not just go along with the majority. For social loafing, you can use techniques like transactive memory, where everybody's assigned to memorize or perform a certain role that leads to a higher task. It promotes accountability and might eliminate some of that loafing. Between groups, you can definitely recommend that people consult outside one's group, and although it's uncomfortable sometimes, but integrating